So I have the opportunity to read these three papers, and I can't find you. All right, let me start again. Sorry about this. We had this nailed before.
Hey, Mark, it's Amy. If it's easier, I can just pull up your slides for you and advance them for you.
Okay, go ahead. If you can do
Okay.
that quicker, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, well, let me start out with something that I said in my introduction, which is these are three dissimilar looking papers that in fact all deal with what is the central, if not one of the central, it is the central problem in commercial bank lending, which is information. And even though they look different, they all tell us something about bank information and how academics ought to be thinking about including information processing in their models. Okay, so this is my, I think I need page 3. Yes, there we go, thank you. So let me start with Amanda's paper about monitoring. This is really awesome data. I'm sure she smiled to herself and maybe overtly when she was talking about how great the data were. Academics frequently talk about monitoring, and it's a little bit of a plug variable that if it looks like it might be relevant, the processing of information in on-site visits, if it looks that way, then an academic is likely to say, yeah, there must be monitoring there. But I'm not sure that we've ever seen data before, and I suspect that if you polled a number of academics and asked them, tell me what you think monitoring means, you'd get as many answers as you had academics in front of you. So we just don't know much. Okay, so next slide, please. There are a lot of interesting connections here between performance and monitoring. So once the monitoring is in place, the paper tells us a lot about subsequent performance. So, and a lot of this is in table 3. More inspections occur for larger, longer term, and riskier loans. Relationship information suggests that past interactions reduce inspections. You've learned something from the past, you know who you can rely on, and you don't have to go out and inspect so much. Fortunately for the paper, more inspections reduce defaults. It's good to know that we don't have 4,000 community bankers doing something that has no effect. And then finally, the language about draws, I thought this was really interesting. This is a pretty low bar, but if they hadn't found that the nature of the commentary in the inspection reports was affecting the probability of a draw going through, then I think they would have had a lot of trouble convincing us that these were in fact important information events. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, this all looks into what happens once you've got some inspections in place. What are the results? Given that we have new information here, I'd rather go back to the beginning in addition to what they have and ask, when do we put inspections into a land development loan? Now, I think the answer is probably almost always, but the more subtle question is, does the number of inspections, the intensity of monitoring, vary with other characteristics of the borrower and of the loan deal? So I've done some work in the past where I've looked at stock analyst expectations when they're trying to predict, the earnings performance of a company. And one of the things we've discussed frequently is, suppose you were a new stock analyst, where would you go to examine a company? Would you go to a company that was very hard to value, and so you were likely to be far off from all the other analysts? Or would you go to a company that's very easy to value, and so your personal opinion wouldn't stand out from other people so much, for good or ill? So I think here we've got the same kind of question. We have rates, fees, amounts, collateral, and inspections, and these are all simultaneously determined. So there's got to be a relationship between, say, the rate and the inspections, or the rate and the collateral, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is a difficult statistical problem because they're all determined simultaneously. And most of our regressions, the simple regressions of the form that you've seen in all three papers, assume that the things on the right-hand side are exogenous. But next question, next paper, please. They've already conquered, to some extent, the instrumental variable problem for inspections. And I would like to see how the loan rate varies with inspections, the exogenous part of inspections, and some of the other characteristics of the loan. So I want to turn the relationship around, and I want to look at what determines the importance of monitoring in these loans. And I'm hoping or assuming that there's enough variation across the loans. The other thing is a minor point. Let me raise that with Amanda later. So next slide, please. Has to do with the third paper. And I think that Janet and Daniel both gave really nice definitions of relationship lending. It's the idea that if a borrower has dealt with a bank repeatedly in the past, and the borrower has a special problem come up, then the bank, the relationship bank, is in a stronger position to help because it's got more private information and they know more about the firm. Now, that creates an information asymmetry problem between the existing lenders and any new lenders, and that of course affects how there's competition in the loan market. So this paper uses the PPP loans to demonstrate the relevance of information asymmetry in bank firm relationships. Next, please. Daniel concludes that repeat borrowers are processed more rapidly. Past depositors are not particularly processed more rapidly. The bank might even fib a little bit for a borrower who falls outside the PPP guidelines, or maybe just pass through an application that they have suspicions about. But the important point is that past loans matter, past deposits don't. But I'm not sure in the current context what this processing rapidity or the larger loan, what that has to do with asymmetric information, because the information here is the same for all people, all borrowers who get PPP loans. They're fully guaranteed. These firms are in pretty bad shape. Daniel has some nice statistics about that. They were in bad shape and getting worse. And it seems to me that if someone is willing to come along and give your creditor what your debtor, excuse me, what is effectively free equity, then any lender is going to be anxious to do that. Next slide, please. And so you're going to get safer loans the faster you can get a PPP loan application approved. Now, here's a quote from late in the paper where Daniel says the evidence is consistent with the evergreening mechanism where banks keep unprofitable firms alive. And I thought that his documentation about the quality of the PPP borrowers, credit quality, was well presented in this context. What I don't see is a connection between this evergreening type mechanism, the fact that if you've got a troubled loan, you'd be happy to have the government take some of the credit risk for you. I don't see that. And what I think of as the usual story about asymmetric information building up over time and giving rise to some sort of preferential access to firms that have longer relationships. So I think that's an expositional thing, which I urge you to work on, Daniel. Next, please. Now I saved this one till last because it gave me the biggest smile. As soon as I realized what they were doing with information asymmetries, I said, that's a great idea. Now, Greg made a comment about that came from a paper by Cheryl Schaffers. My recollection of the same sort of comment goes back a long time. First really big failure in the United States in the post-war period, Franklin National Bank. They had been operating in Mineola, Long Island, and they decided to move into Manhattan, and they got a headquarters building at 450 Park Avenue. And they decided they were in the big leagues. They were going to play in the big leagues, and they were going to expand their corporate loan portfolio. And there was a Wall Street Journal article that I read at the time where a lender at another bank said, every time I read about a new customer going to Franklin National Bank, I knew it was a customer that we would never lend to. So it's the same story as the Cheryl Schaffer quote. And it suggests that at least in some contexts, information asymmetry is important in the lending process. Next page. The basic concept underlying this paper says essentially, there's a lot of information about firms in the world, borrowers, and I know some of it, and my competitors know some of it. And if my competitors, at least some of them, have bad information that I don't see, then I'm in more danger of extending a loan that gets accepted because the rate that I charge doesn't reflect the information that other people know and I don't. So the fact that I get a loan says that I'm offering the best terms. Let's think of it simplistically as the lowest interest rate. The more opportunities there are for other competitors to have negative information, the less happy in some sense I should be about getting the loan. So there's this concept of the winner's curse. If I win a contest where we're all bidding against one another, maybe I overvalued the value of the item being auctioned, or maybe in this case I undervalued the riskiness of the loan applicant. Next, please. So this is a slide that Greg gave you, and I think it's a very important slide. What he does in the horizontal axis is plots the number of banks in a county, and on the vertical axis he plots the markup, by which he means sort of relative to the best default rate implied by the available information. This is how much higher the loan rate is than that default rate would imply. So the loan rate is some sort of riskless rate plus a markup for expected losses. And this says that with lots of lenders, you've got a lot of opportunities for unseen bad information to be around. And the same thing happens with PDs. It's not just competition, it's PDs, probability of default, that people take account of what they don't know and what others might. So if I get the loan, I might be looking at a larger PD than I first thought. So next, there we go. I basically believe this story in its broad outline. Two estimation issues came up. One is a question of consistency, and I don't know what it means, and it may mean nothing. But Greg makes the point that if there's only one bank in a market, then you'd expect there to be a larger markup. Well, he shows us that coefficient 2 times, once in table 5 and once in table 6. And one time it's significantly negative, and one time it's significantly positive. So I don't know why that is, and I suggest that he find a story about that and try to understand, because that was, in fact, like a touchstone of his development. If I only got one bank, this information asymmetry stuff isn't relevant, but monopoly markups are relevant. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is a little bit more subtle, which is the markup information comes from regressing the loan rate on information about the loan. Risk information, generated internally, PD, LGD, and some presenting characteristics of the borrower. Here's the thing I'm worried about. If he were regressing the markup, the loan rate relative to the similar maturity treasury rate, or the markup relative to the Fed funds rate, then I wouldn't be worried about this. But it seems to me that this specification allows the markup to be negative, because there's nothing in this regression that says that the loan rate minus the markup has to be above the riskless rate of interest. So I suggest that they redo that table, which is table 3, and it is very important to their paper. I suggest they redo that table in terms of spreads. And in fact, with the number of credit lines they have, maybe a lot of their information is already spreads. But I suggest they look at that and see if it makes any difference. And Greg, if you want to talk about that further, I'd be happy to. Next slide. Some suggestions for further confirmation. You could, in theory, say, suppose I had N banks and we're all drawing unbiased estimates of the same information about the default probability of our loan, of our borrower. How would how would my probability of getting a loan vary with the number of banks in the area? Would it look like figure 2? Would it be that the adverse selection winner's curse problem is in fact bigger, even in a regime where there's no bad information to be had? So this is an order statistics kind of problem, and I don't know how to do it, but it's well known. And I think it would be nice to look at a variant of table figure 2 and ask how the terms of the loan would vary with the number of applicants. Quickly, I think you might cut the larger loans out of the sample, see if it's more dramatic. And then last, you might think about the using an MSA, metropolitan statistical area, instead of a county as the geographic unit. Okay, last page. These are 3 nice papers. They each tell us something interesting and a little bit different about information in bank lending models. I enjoyed them all and recommend them to you. Thank you very much.